They have no sense of what came before and what we are reacting against in the kinds of theories we use. So in a way, that I experienced some relief that there were others, you know, I guess who had the same pitfalls. But I was also, of course, happy that there is a questioning of these particular approaches. Because I think what's happening is a repeat of, in the case of feminism, a repeat of imperial feminism. It's not the same imperial feminism as in the 70s, which, by the way, we Filipino women could resist then, right? Because we had a firm sense of our own society, we had an analysis of US imperialism and so on, but we don't have that anymore. So it's a very, very difficult thing. One of the most important topics for Filipino feminists today, for example, is the diaspora, right? Of overseas Filipino workers. Because of these current approaches, the focus is on individuals and how they resist and oppose. The focus is on their so-called agency, that is their ability to act, which supposedly suggests their empowerment. None of these studies, by the way, really spend time to explicate, to explain neoliberalism. Or what imperialism means. One of the latest things that I read was a manuscript, which I actually was happy to get, because its focus, instead of looking at the subjectivities, so-called subjectivities of overseas contract workers, its focus was on the Philippine state. Now that to me was significant, because now here is an acknowledgement that the state is not dead. And of course that's really strange for anyone to say the state is dead when, you know, you have US imperialism, the nation, you know, US imperial state wreaking havoc in Iraq, right? And anyway, so I was very, very happy to look at this manuscript. But what was curious was that as it described the Philippine nation state as a brokerage state, what this author meant was that the Philippine nation state serves as a broker for labor. And I think you all know that, right? I mean, we have all the institutions and agencies that recruit and send off workers, 3,000 a day. You're all aware of that, right? And the Philippines, by the way, has the most established structures and institutions for doing this. So although the author acknowledged that, yes, you know, you have neoliberal policy, you have IMF and World Bank, that somehow is a connection with the Philippines as a brokerage state, in fact, the author mentions that the Philippines is somehow a model. This role as a brokerage state is a model for development for other countries like Vietnam, for example. So, you know, instead of critiquing or explaining why the Philippine state has to resort to this kind of function, this brokerage function, she sees it as a model for others to follow. So despite, however, this kind of, so what I'm saying now is that what's happening is that the macro, the larger system, has been sacrificed. You know, the macro that used to be the focus of analysis here in the Philippines of you know, the women's movement and the feminism in the 70s and 80s. The macro has been thrown out, and attention is centered on what's called the micro-politics of everyday life. And on, you know, women's, in the case of feminism, and on women's everyday acts of resistance. Spontaneous acts, individual acts that take place without much political deliberation. In spite of this, however, I think there are a few symptoms of changes coming. For example, there's a book by Naomi Klein. Now, this is not a new book at all, but I think it's important to mention because the title of the book is No Logo. Yes. Yeah. And I think she was impelled to write it in part because of her research in Rosario Cavite, the export processing zone, and that constitutes the bulk of her material. But she has one chapter there that is particularly noteworthy. I should mention, however, that she's not an academician, and that's probably why she can do it. Because academicians, I don't really have much hope. I mean, women's studies, although I teach women's studies, I think it needs to be turned inside out, and and in part because it's been institutionalized, right? And also because there's no women's movement. In other words, there's no connection now between theory and practice. There's just theory. And when you're doing theory, you can do anything, right? You can say anything. And of course, women's studies professors still urge their students to do activism. By that they mean sending their students to the Asian American Cultural Center, to the GLBT, that is the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender center, I guess to find out what their specific problems are, right? That are part of their identity. That's activism. So anyway, to go back to Naomi Klein's No Logo, she has a chapter there. By the way, she has a new book, which is Shock Doctrine. And it's great. But again, she's not an academic feminist. Anyway, it's still worth mentioning because I assigned one of her chapters in this No Logo. It's a chapter titled Patriarchy Goes Funky. And students like that because, first of all, the title is really hip. But also because in it, she talks about, she's a young woman, so she has not been out of college for too long. So she writes about how when she was in college, she and her peers were engaged in, she's Canadian, were engaged in, all kinds of activities, but surrounding identity politics. How they would protest racism against blacks, against Jews, against, all those forms of identity. And she said what she found out, was that, in fact, transnational corporations can easily absorb identity politics and use it as marketing niche. They can profit from it, and they can, and especially they can use youth culture. Because transnational corporations have a meta-narrative, they have an understanding of capitalism, they know how profit works, right? So anyway, she said, she gave the metaphor. She said, well, I found out that what we were doing was